So welcome everyone to this webinar with Darren Jones MP, Chair of the BEIS Select Committee, in conversation with Sienna Rodgers, Editor of LabourList, Labour's favourite online newsletter. I'm Hamish Sanderson, Chair of Labour Business. Now, most of our webinars are open to all, but this one is for members only, to say a huge thank you for all of your support, financial and otherwise, without which we could not survive as the oldest, largest and only business membership group affiliated to the party. As most of you know, Labour Business was founded by Harold Wilson, no less, in 1972, to enable the Labour Party to have a conversation with the business community, on the basis that if we don't listen to business, there's no reason why business should listen to us. And you, the members, make it possible for us to have that conversation. And it's more important, I think, today than ever before. Now, we all know we're living in extraordinary times, extraordinary challenges, but also, I think, of great opportunities. The challenge is first and foremost to beat COVID-19 and then to prevent a health disaster from becoming an economic catastrophe. The opportunity, I think, is to bury austerity for good, to restore adequate funding for public services and those who work in them, and to recalibrate our economic model with a Green New Deal which will be fairer, more resilient and more sustainable. Our view, which I know our members share, is that good businesses must be part of the solution to these challenges. But there must be no return to a business as usual economy which has failed. Now, Labour Business and its members have a big part to play in helping Labour rise to these challenges and seize these opportunities. And since Keir Starmer was elected on April the 4th, our first priority has been to engage with his new leadership team. So we've helped Keir to formulate his new message that business is part of the solution to these multiple crises. And we work directly with Annalise Dodds, with Ed Miliband, as they start to engage with the business community, hosting a joint webinar with them in April and another with Ed last Monday, and one more to come with Annalise next Thursday. You should have received an invitation for that this afternoon, in fact. And many of you attended our webinar with Lucy Powell, the new Shadow Business Minister, on the impact of coronavirus on small businesses. And if you missed it, the recording is on our website. But above all, our focus in the last few months has been to scrutinise the shortcomings, both in terms of policy and delivery, of the government's financial support package to businesses affected by coronavirus, and to recommend ways to fix that package. This has included our 2 coronavirus member surveys, the case histories in our last 2 newsletters, which we have shared with the Shadow Cabinet as ammunition in their efforts to hold the government to its promises, and 2 submissions to Darren's very own Select Committee, investigating the impact of coronavirus on businesses and workers. Looking ahead, I think it's clear that Labour Business and businesses more generally will need to find new ways of working. And that's why we've conducted a strategic review within Labour Business of all of our operations. One early output from that is the launch of Labour Business TV on our website, using the latest video conferencing technology to share interviews with leading politicians, including Darren, and business leaders. We've also relaunched our 9 policy groups, and these are the engines of our business engagement and policy development work. And the good thing is that we are all working online now, which enables our members from up and down the country to participate fully. So if you haven't already joined a policy group, I encourage you to do so, again, via our website. So let me move on now to the main event, our interview with Darren. And to conduct the interview and the Q&A afterwards, we are absolutely delighted to welcome the editor of LabourList, Sienna Rodgers. She publishes lots of articles from Labour Business members, including regular updates on the pandemic from our very own pub landlady, Liz Hine. Sienna, thank you so much for joining us, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Sienna Rodgers. I edit LabourList, which is a site about sort of the inside track of the Labour Party. We've got news and comment. We've got the sort of minutiae of what's going on in terms of the different factions and the internal elections. But we've also got pieces from people who support Labour but are out in the real world talking about their experiences and their experiences under this Tory government. So check us out, sign up to our daily email, obviously. Hello, Darren. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I hope you don't mind me sitting in my comfy armchair. It's at that point in the week where I'm starting to flag, but I hope I'll be able to provide interesting answers to your questions, even if I'm sat comfortably.
No, that is absolutely fine. I feel exactly the same. Well, congratulations on your new role. You only recently elected as the Select Committee Chair. Did you expect to be elected as Chair? You were against some big hitters in the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Yeah, so it wasn't something that I'd been planning for a long time. It was just an opportunity that arose because all of the Labour members on the previous committee were appointed to particular briefs on the front bench. So we had a kind of clean slate on the Bay Select Committee. And whilst I was working with David Lammy and Lord Faulkner in the Justice teams, I saw an opportunity to have a go at chairing what is a very interesting committee, certainly at the moment. But you are right, Sienna. I admit I was punching a bit above my weight, running against Angela Eagle and Stella Creasy, both of whom are senior colleagues in the Parliamentary Labour Party, Angela having served in government as well as in opposition, and Stella being a formidable campaigner. And so I was delighted to have won, even if the odds were maybe stacked a little against me at the start.
Do you think there's anything that you'll do differently to Rachel Reeves as Chair?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, Rachel was fantastic as chair of the Base Committee, and I think she's being even more fantastic as Michael Gove's shadow. And I just wish every time we see their exchanges across the dispatch box that we were actually in government, so that Rachel was doing his job and not the other way around. I think the work that we're doing as a committee, and Rachel started this when she launched the impact of COVID on workers and business inquiry, is having to move with the economic circumstances in which we're currently working. So of course, Rachel wouldn't have been envisaging doing, like my super inquiry on post-pandemic economic growth, for example, and thinking, how on earth is government going to spend billions of pounds worth of fiscal stimulus across the country? How do we speed up net zero delivery? How do we make sure that every region and nation is getting the support that it needs? And so in many ways, the kind of economic circumstance in which we found ourselves presents an opportunity to persuade the government and to put forward ideas about how we build back better and reset the economy. And I suppose before the pandemic, Rachel perhaps wouldn't have anticipated such an exciting kind of opportunity to do that. So different topics and different approaches, but I don't think it's a reflection of perhaps different leadership styles.
I was wondering because, I mean, as you mentioned, you're in the Justice team and your background is in law. Do you think that will inform in any way your approach to the role?
Yeah, but I was a bit of a corporate sellout as a lawyer, to be honest. I mean, so my background was commercial law. I wasn't doing anything kind of particularly honourable from a Justice team perspective. But it does mean that I have a commercial background, both in private practice and in-house inside big businesses, where I had to understand and apply kind of changes in the law and regulation. So I hope that experience means that I understand it not just from the perspective of a legislator now, but also from the perspective of having to implement it inside businesses and thinking about how you can achieve the best possible outcomes through policy and regulation, as opposed to just kind of asking for things and hoping that it would happen.
Mm. So I wanted to start with energy, that part of your role. I mean, you've got at the moment this inquiry into net zero and the UN climate summits going on. So you're looking at the UK's 2050 net zero target in terms of that committee. But obviously there's this ongoing debate within the Labour Party. Ed Miliband only last night said that he still supported Labour's commitment to a 2030 emissions reduction target, which obviously, while it's becoming more and more urgent for us to decarbonise, it's also more difficult because Labour hasn't won power. So how do you feel about those different targets? Which one would you support?
So, I mean, I support the manifesto commitment on getting there by 2030. And I think in the time when we need to show international leadership, because we are running COP26, we need to be able to try and show the world when we're asking them to do these things that we're doing them ourselves. But my only kind of caveat is that I'm not particularly interested in having big debates about whether it should be 2030 or 2031 or kind of, April 2032. What I am interested in is actually what are the policy answers, what are the changes we need to see in the economy in order to actually decarbonize. And some things will happen quicker than other things. And in fact, different parts of the UK can get to net zero quicker than other parts of the UK because of their physical geography or the way in which industry is placed across the country. So I don't think we should get too wrapped up in a very black and white debate about what the date is that we're going to get everything done by, because it is much more kind of sophisticated than that. But we do need to hold the government's feet to the fire. You've seen Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and others talk using some of our language, talking about a green revolution, but they've really got to deliver that. And we already know from the Prime Minister that he thinks he can just stand up and say things like build, 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 and jobs, 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 and that he thinks that's actually going to improve things, when he's then not actually making any decisions on support for industry or for workers or extending furlough. So I'm not convinced that we're going to see the real progress we need from the government, but they are talking about it as if they want to. And so the job of I have, and my committee has, is not just to put forward the policy proposals and the evidence to show the government how to do it, and there's a lot of that now, but it's also to hold them to account. And I'll certainly be doing that from my committee's perspective, as well as I know Ed will be doing it from the shadow-based team.
Yeah, as you say, I think that's really interesting how Rishi Sunak has been talking about a green industrial revolution, obviously sort of taking Labour's framing there, but so far doesn't seem to be actually delivering the goods in terms of concrete policy. I mean, the green activists in the Labour Party in particular are focused on having green commitments attached to bailouts, particularly during this crisis, and in the aviation sector particularly. How do you feel about those?
I agree entirely, and I don't know why the UK hasn't been putting conditions on its bailouts already. And an example that I think it was Marina Mazzucato gave to my committee the other week was that, in France and Germany, they've done aviation sector bailouts, and that's the right thing to do, but they did attach conditions to it. And we gave a bailout to EasyJet with no conditions, and a week later, they then gave Stelios and some other shareholders hundreds of millions of pounds, having taken equivalent amounts from taxpayers, and that's clearly unacceptable and quite short-sighted for the government not to put conditions on it. But this isn't just a Labour Party position that conditions should be attached. I mean, this is something that comes up from people who are apolitical, who are representing parts of industry or the kind of NGO sector, because decarbonisation and net zero isn't a discrete policy in its own right over here anymore. It has to be inherent to every single economic decision that we take, and that will require some form of conditionality or incentivization through policy to kind of nudge the economy in that direction. And there are many, many businesses now. I mean, I had the chair of the Prince of Wales's corporate leaders group before the committee this morning. 250 businesses, I think it was, signed a letter saying that they see the opportunity of net zero and they want to have a green recovery. So, when Labour talks about this, we talk about it not just from a party political perspective, but actually as a shared view across very big chunks of the economy. But ultimately, it requires the government to take those decisions. And so far, we've not, as you say, seen anything substantive from them.
I mean, do you think we're talking about conditions on bailouts, we're talking about incentivizing businesses to make these moves? Do you think it's possible to achieve this scale of change on either of these net zero targets without significant behaviour change? And do you think that's what we should be aiming for, to do it all without having to tell people, for example, I'm sorry, but you just can't take domestic flights anymore? Is that the aim?
So I think consumer behaviour change is an important part of the decarbonising journey. We want people to eat less poor quality meat. We quite like people to think about public transport as opposed to driving, especially in city centres where there are air pollution issues, and to think maybe even about the carbon costs of domestic consumption and the things that we buy and the way that we live our lives. But I think this is a really important point. We had Lord Deben, who's the chairman of the Climate Change Committee, before my committee this morning, and they launched their progress report to Parliament last week, which showed that the government is falling significantly behind on its commitments. But it does set out a roadmap to achieving net zero, and it does build in assumptions that you can do that without consumer behavioural changes. You can do that through infrastructure, you can do it through financing, you can do it through the way in which you invest. Now, that's in order to meet the 2050 target. So the debate then is, therefore, if you want to meet it by 2030, what's the gap between what the Committee on Climate Change is saying for 2050 without consumer behavioural change compared to where we want to get to in 2030. So there are interesting policy ideas, one you've raised about frequent flyer taxes. And it's been really interesting to look at the Climate Assembly, the Citizens Assembly that my committee was the lead sponsor for. And we started to see some of their output from their interim report, because it shows that the public sometimes have a misunderstanding about how these policies might affect them. And the frequent flyer tax is a great example, because many people felt that if they maybe go on holiday in the summer and maybe in the winter, that they thought they were going to get enormous taxes. But actually, the vast majority of flights are flown by a very, very small percentage of people, and it's largely business related. And so actually a frequent flyer tax doesn't really affect, taking 1 or 2 short holidays to Europe during the year. And so that the way in which we therefore communicate consumer behavioural change politically as the Labour Party is really important, so it doesn't scare people, because we can achieve these targets without kind of telling people what they can and can't do at a minute level in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff about a just transition. I think it caused some controversy at Labour conference, because some trade unions, especially the ones representing energy workers, were saying, well, actually it's regarded as a kind of dirty word, a dirty term by their members who just don't believe that just transition for workers is possible. And Labour clearly has huge amounts of work to do to actually convince the wider Labour movement that it is possible, doesn't it?
Well, there's 2 bits to that just transition puzzle, which is really important. There's just transition in terms of taking an economy-wide view as to how you do that transition. So there'll be some, high energy intensive industrial sectors, for example, where it will take longer for them to be able to decarbonize compared to other sectors, and that's okay. And actually government, if it is intervening or providing fiscal support, needs to do that in a way which maybe accelerates that transition. So you might look at the way in which you can produce steel, for example. Some of our manufacturing plants have still got kit from the 1980s. We could probably co-invest and bring that up to making more efficient production of steel, for example. But the other side of the just transition, which is really important from a trade union member's perspective, a worker's perspective, is that there will be changes in the way in which manufacturing processes are done that will affect the type of jobs that we currently have. And even without net zero transition being sped up, whether it's because of digitization or just because of the way of global markets, whatever it might be, people will start to find that the type of work they've maybe done is changed. But the state therefore has to partner with unions and with businesses to provide that just transition in terms of training and skills from the jobs from the old economy to the jobs of the new economy. And the thing that the Tories are really bad at is funding people through fiscal stimulus, not just funding infrastructure. And my big concern through this COVID pandemic, where there are already thousands and thousands of redundancies being announced, and very significant numbers in my own constituency, there's just nothing in place from government which helps with that just transition with training and skills to finding new job opportunities. And that's something that we need to keep talking about. And that's why I welcome Keir's emphasis on a jobs first budget.
Yeah, let's talk about the coronavirus crisis, obviously the main issue of the day. During the crisis, I think there have been really mixed messages from the government in terms of, often they've made a statement on changes, but then the guidance has come quite a bit later. This has all been quite confusing for workers and businesses. There are big gaps in the advice as well, and it's been quite unclear sometimes. They've now, for instance, reduced the 2 metre rule to 1 metre plus, but that's after businesses have just spent lots of money on putting up signs saying 2 metres. So Usdaw has advised shops to stick to the 2 metre rule, for instance. How do you think the government has done in handling that lifting of the lockdown, the gradual changes?
Well, I think my answer will come of no surprise to you or to anyone else. And, our front bench have been doing a fantastic job in raising these issues in a constructive tone with the government to point out that you can't just completely you can't just keep doing kind of U-turns or saying one thing and then doing another, because actually people need to adjust to this. And, we took evidence on my committee from businesses and business groups who made it very clear that essentially they didn't really know what they were having to do. They didn't know where to turn for help. Local authorities were being then given a lot of the responsibility, but without the resource or the extra funding to be able to roll that out. And essentially people have just had to try to make the best of it. And I mean, government is never going to set out specified rules for every type of setting that you could imagine in the high street. So they have to set principles, but they have to be communicated clearly based on the evidence and realistically deliverable and consistent. And the government has kind of failed on all of those things. And so you've ended up in this situation where shop owners maybe don't have the confidence, consumers therefore might not have the confidence. And we actually fail the economy by not having confidence in these guidelines in the first place, because we need people to be able to go back to their, their high streets and to buy their stuff from independent retailers. And the government not giving anybody confidence about the way in which the lockdown is being lifted causes further economic damage that didn't need to happen.
Yeah. The other kind of thing that's really come out is a lot of self-employed people in particular have been hit hard in the crisis. And a lot of those people have been excluded from support schemes because they didn't earn enough or they were recently self-employed. And there was this video went around on Twitter this week of this curtain fitter who was just talking about just how much you're suffering. I don't know if you saw that, but it was absolutely heartbreaking of that guy crying. Makes me feel awful. But I mean, it often seems as though self-employed people are often just more vulnerable generally because they don't have that security. It's to be expected. But also they often don't have those kind of big representatives around the table making decisions. How do you think the government has handled this crisis for the self-employed? But also, what do you think Labour can do to improve its offer? Because a lot of the time it does seem as if it's about employed workers who have big trade unions behind them, and the self-employed people who are in these very precarious situations just don't have that kind of same backing.
Yeah, so I suppose to kind of roll back a bit in the chronology, Labour was calling for support for self-employed workers literally, I'm pretty sure, from the very beginning of this whole debate. We were calling for the furlough program as well, the jobs retention scheme, and the government adopted that, which was good. And then pretty much straight out of the bat, our front bench was saying, well, hang on, how does this work for people who are freelancers or self-employed or in the gig economy? And eventually then the government kind of caught up. But as you say, lots of people have been missing out because of the way in which the rules have been applied. And what that shows to me is that, self-employed workers were just an afterthought for the government. And they don't recognize, or they don't seem to recognize, that the vast majority of people who work in this way, they're not kind of, enormously well-paid senior consultants who are just trying to pay 20% corporation tax as opposed to 50% income tax. I mean, there are some of those, but I mean, by far it's the minority. And, somewhere like my constituency in Bristol, where you see, how important the creative and the arts sector is in film and in industry, as well as all the other music and the things that you can imagine in those sectors. A lot of people work in those ways because that's the way the industry works. And they provide a crucial part of the economy that's completely just being kind of left to kind of whittle away without any support at all and without any clear guidelines on how to come back. The question on representation, I think, is really important. I think there's a challenge here to the unions. I think unions need to be modernising just as much as the Labour Party and everybody else in order to be fit for the economy and the kind of country that we want to represent and engage with. I see no reason why self-employed workers can't feel at home in a trade union, even if they're not in a kind of organised factory shop floor setting, because you can organise now, like this, even if you are individually working, if you've got collective shared interests, if you work in sectors or types of work, you can organise collaboratively, even if you're not physically in the same kind of factory setting. And we need to do much more to persuade people to join trade unions on that basis and to organise on their behalf. But I think there's also an opportunity here because the Tories have completely kind of left them behind. Remembering, after the 2008 financial crash, the government were positively promoting this form of employment to people. We saw a spike in people becoming self-employed. Quite a lot of people, because of the 2008 financial crisis, were becoming self-employed but being paid less than the minimum wage. And so there are other kind of issues there that are of interest to us. And I think the Labour Party now has an opportunity to make the case to people who are self-employed, because ultimately it's about labour. It doesn't matter whether you're organised in full-time employment or whether you're a self-employed freelancer. It's about labour and labour rights. And the Tories have shown their true colours on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels kind of on a related point that feels as though no political party, including Labour, the party of workers, has really got to grips with the effects of automation on the future and the present of work. Is already changing the world of work. And there seems to be this tension, which we hope obviously is false, between resisting any kind of change, which is arguably futile. And on the other hand, allowing workers to be left behind. And surely there's a kind of third way, and it just seems like there's not enough engagement on that.
Yeah, so I've always been an advocate for speeding up the pace of change and speeding up the modernisation of the economy, because we have underlying issues that we know have negative consequences for workers. So the British economy has been unproductive for a decade and probably longer. And we know that if the economy is not productive, you're not going to increase profits, you're not going to increase wages in order to be able to see household incomes go up, but also taxation to fund public services better. And compared to lots of other countries like ours in the OECD, we've been particularly bad at this. And my view for a long time has been, automation, digitization, the adoption of technology in the way that we provide services and manufacture goods and deliver public services has to be the answer for improving that productivity and therefore living standards. But the kind of disruption of that is the way in which we work and the types of jobs that are available will change. And so you need the government to be able to kind of put the stabilizers on that process, both in terms of incentivizing and helping businesses to do this. And remember, SMEs are they're 99.5% of the private sector SMEs. And we need to help them in a much different way to, say, the big multinationals or the FTSE 100 companies with digitization. But you then also need to help workers whose jobs are changing and make sure that young people, whether they're in their apprenticeships or through school or university or technical training, are getting the know-how to be able to use the technology in a way that means that we actually do achieve that productivity. And that is about the Labour Party, because that's about Labour being productive, being able to take opportunities to contribute to our economic outputs, but it has to be based on a modernized digital economy. And so this pandemic has started to speed that up, but in an uncontrolled way. And we've seen some of the negative consequences of that. And that's why we're calling for the government to, as I say, put some of the stabilizers on the machine.
That brings me on to the last thing that I'll ask about before we go to Q&A is, obviously during lockdown, digital has become so much more important. I know it's something you're really interested in because you've got that group Labour Digital and you're chair of PIC4, I think, if you're still chair of it. And it really is crucial that people have access to internet and fast broadband, and networks being able to support huge increases in daily traffic. These are all issues that have come up. What do you think of that Labour broadband policy from 2019 in retrospect now? And how should the state intervene in terms of broadband access to make sure that it is available across the country in those hard to reach corners where currently they don't have, full fibre broadband?
So it's a good question. I suppose there's a few points to it. One is that digital connectivity to me is an essential utility like water, heating, power, because we just need it now for our day-to-day lives. And so we need to ensure that it's seen that way. And that's not just about kind of fiber broadband going down the street, but it's about mobile connectivity as well. The second point is that all it really has done is it's highlighted existing inequalities based on income, because if actually paying for your line rental and your broadband and then having a laptop or a tablet or something in your home, it's actually really quite expensive. And many households can't afford it, which is why lots of poorer households tend to just have their mobile phones, but often with kind of data caps on. And we've seen the stories, whether it's 4 kids at home having to try to do their schooling over their mum's one iPhone, and then the data cap kicks in, you can't afford to pay extra data. And that's a real problem because it entrenches those existing inequalities and accelerates them. So the state has to intervene to deal with that. But there's also been other inequalities, for example, in geography. And we sometimes forget about this in the Labour Party, but sometimes a lot of the poorest communities in the country are in rural communities, not actually just in city communities. And they're often sadly represented by Conservative MPs, but these rural communities have now started to see the geographical inequality accentuated through digital infrastructure, and are also calling for this to be sped up. To answer your question on the broadband policy from the last election, so there was 2 bits to that policy as far as I understood it. Actually, there was 3 bits. There was kind of a nationalisation bit, there was a universal service obligation bit, and then there was giving everybody free broadband bit. you know, the idea of a universal service obligation for digital connectivity, I'm kind of open to, because as I say, it's kind of basic utility and everybody should have, you know, a basic level of access. So I support that. There's a whole debate about how you deliver it and pay for it and all that stuff, but in principle, I support it. The bit that I found a little amusing at the last election was that we were then just going to give everybody a free broadband package. We don't give people free water or free power, even if we do have the pleasure of owning the infrastructure. It just means we regulate those economies to ensure that there is a, you know, a more equal distribution and access to it. So I kind of agreed with half of it, but the other half seemed a bit odd. Having said that, in the context in which we now find ourselves, I think there's a legitimacy to saying, especially for households with children, maybe households on universal credit, that maybe we need to find a product or a way to ensure that people that can't afford to pay the rates that are available on the market for connectivity have a subsidized access or a kind of regulated access to a basic product in order to be able to have access. So you're kind of in that space, which maybe the policy was slightly ahead of its time, and then, well, maybe I didn't realize it at the time.
It does seem like it was kind of a policy aimed at like businesses in rural areas and and self-employed people and small businesses in those areas, but that message didn't cut through because it came across just as another goodie in Labour's kind of goodie a day giveaway thing. So I think the communication needs to be worked on there. But I will start with our questions now. I think, Rachel, you had a question that kind of relates to what we've just been talking about. If you'd like to ask it yourself, that'd be great.
Okay, so my question is, I work as a company secretary at a bank that employs 46,000 people globally. As a result of COVID-19, at its peak, 95% or more of staff were working from home. This seems to have caused a fundamental cultural shift in the company, and it is unlikely that working in the office will ever be the same again. What policies should Labour be supporting to facilitate this?
Great question, Rachel. I welcome this transition, and there's a couple of things I suppose I would call out. One is, many businesses have realized that they can trust their workers to be productive at home. Some people felt before that if you were at home, you'd kind of put your feet up and watch the TV or do the washing or whatever. But actually, and there's evidence now with some quantifiable studies around this, our productivity tends to increase if we work from home, because we're not on the commute every day. You might be more productive in the time that you have to be able to get things done. And there are benefits to that for business. I don't think we're all going to just work from home forever more, because there's still a lot of value in collaboration and interaction. And I think you're going to hopefully get to this halfway house where people have more rights for flexible working and to work from home, but maybe can come and collaborate with their teams in an office setting kind of as and when they need to. There are some risks though. So we've already seen some platforms and technologies that are basically kind of anti-privacy and surveillance, and some employers saying, oh, well, you've got to be online and answer your Skype message within 1 minute, otherwise it will be a disciplinary issue, or saying, oh, well, you weren't logged on to Slack for 4 hours of the day, and this is a disciplinary issue. And so there is a regulatory question around there about how the kind of conversation on privacy and digital rights and digital technologies works in a workplace health and safety context if we're now working from home as opposed to working in the workplace. And the last thing I would mention, and this came up when I was visiting the hospital in my constituency the other week, was again about the inequality. So for those of us who have the luxury of a private space in our homes where we can do work quietly, where we've already talked about access to online and the equipment to be able to do that, you know, that works well. But there are many, many people who don't have that. And so the question is, well, if you can't work from home, maybe you're in a 1-bedroom flat or a 2-bedroom flat with kids and there's kind of no quiet space to go, or you're sharing a house and there's no private space to go. Are there new things that might allow you to benefit from the flexibility of working, as opposed to those people having to go into the office? And I love this idea that, you know, on our high streets, and we know that high streets need reviving and independent retailers are struggling, maybe we should start to have more kind of co-working spaces in our local high streets, not just in our city centres, so that if you don't want to work from home, but you don't want to go into town in order to go to the office, you can actually just walk somewhere locally and collaborate with people that you might not normally collaborate with and have access to these services. And maybe there's a role for governments or councils in terms of providing that form of modern support. But there's a whole host of workplace debates around there that we're going to need to get right.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I love that. Liz Hind asks, what about small business owners that are employers? Can they ever be represented by unions or work collaboratively with them?
So hello, Liz, and I've seen your tweets and your correspondence, and thank you for sending it to me. And hopefully you've seen that we as a committee have been in correspondence with ministers around guidelines for pubs and hospitality and retail sectors. And I agree with you that they've not been good enough on that. To answer the substance of your question, I think it goes to the heart of this kind of modernisation agenda that I referred to earlier. I absolutely don't see any legitimate reason as to why the Labour Party or trade unions or new forms of collaborating can't work in settings with self-employed people or different structures and forms of employment. Because we shouldn't just be kind of boxed into the idea that we've got to do a kind of 19th, 20th century kind of approach to kind of collective action or collective lobbying. Why can't we do it in different settings and different structures? It's just, you know, working together and achieving more together than we do alone. Sorry to be cheesy about it, but you know, we can do that. We've just got to have those conversations and build those networks. And I think that, again, that's where, you know, the Labour Party and the unions and others need to think about how they modernise the way in which we organise and communicate and network and build power in local communities to meet the changing world around us and not just get stuck in the structures of the past.
I'm going to read out a question from Rod Dowler now, Chair of Labour Business Policy Group. He's asking about investment. So he says, given that some sectors such as leisure, hospitality, retailing and travel will contract with many job losses, how should Labour pressure the government to invest in sectors with opportunities for growth and new jobs? These could include strengthening the digital infrastructure, broadband and 5G, and speeding the transition to renewable energy by installing more vehicle charging points and installing domestic heat pumps and solar panels.
Great question. Basically, you're asking what's the industrial strategy? And we've got this really weird situation at the moment where we have an industrial strategy, capital I, capital S, as defined, with a department. It's in the name of the department, in the name of my committee. It has some budget attached to it. There's a National Industrial Strategy Council. But it's kind of being ignored by the government. It's very odd. It's kind of over there. And then the government is then doing all of these other things in thinking about interventions in the market and using public funds and changing laws and regulations to assist the private sector economy, which is essentially industrial strategy, but small I, small s, undefined. And the two aren't connected. And the trouble with that is that you then can't hold the government to account in a transparent way because they're not setting out the basis on which they make decisions around investing public money, how government's going to operate as a shareholder, how you pick strategic sectors, whether the government is going to pick certain businesses and certain technologies, or whether it's going to set broader missions and allow different companies to bid and operate for that support and pull in that direction. And we just then don't know how the government is going to make these really, really crucial decisions. And we're pushing the government to recognize this problem in having an industrial strategy over here and ignoring it, and doing industrial strategy over here, but without any transparency around it. And so my committee will be launching 2 sub-inquiries before the summer recess under our post-pandemic economic growth inquiry. One is going to be reviewing the industrial strategy, both the formal bit and the informal bit, and actually saying to government, well, you need some coherent kind of strategy around this. And the second thing we're going to be looking at is broadly devolution. Do we have the structures across the regions and nations of the country to deliver growth that levels up the economy, but also works for local people? And I'll give you a hint. I think the answer is no, which is why we're doing it, to try and put forward some proposals on how to improve that.
Paul Hendrick, Treasurer of Labour Business, asks, a major element of government COVID relief for companies has been loan schemes, saddling companies with, for many, unsustainable debt. According to lobby group The City UK, this could amount to 105 billion. Particularly given the possible additional hit of a no-deal Brexit, we're likely to see a wave of insolvencies. The typical response would be a mixture of predatory pre-pack administrations and random, poorly thought through government bailouts, which I guess we've seen. Should Labour not be advocating a more targeted approach of taking stakes in businesses and sectors which fit our green high-tech agenda?
Yeah, so the great thing with these questions is they contain about 4 or 5 questions in each question, which is a very clever way of doing it. There's a question about what do you do with the debt you've already given to companies, especially maybe in the retail and hospitality sector or smaller businesses that just took the loans because they needed it to survive, but maybe are going to find the economic period ahead difficult and therefore struggle to service the debt. And this is especially important for businesses who have high rental commitments in commercial property, where the payments have been delayed but not kind of written off, and landlords are going to want them to start to pay this back very, very quickly. And that poses a very systemic issue, I think, to the economy. And so the City UK, for example, and the stuff that you've referenced in your question, and others have been saying, well, maybe the way in which you pay these loans back can be different. Maybe they need to be a kind of a student loans type model. So the more profit you earn, the more you pay back until you paid it off. So that for those parts of the bits of the economy that will take longer to reopen, they get kind of longer to pay it back. On the face of it, that seems like a fairly pragmatic suggestion, and we'll need to look at the detail of that. Then there's the question around equity, which I think is really interesting, because owning businesses can look very, very different, of course. You know, you can have fully nationalized industries where government just owns it and kind of runs it, or you can have stakes in business. And if you have a stake in a business, and we've seen the government do this with the Future Fund, where it was giving money to kind of higher risk but higher growth startup scale-up businesses, where it was co-invested with private sector finance, and they've said that it's convertible to equity if they can't pay back the debt. And there are 2 points that I'll just pull out of that before we can go on to the next question. One is, how does government operate as a shareholder? Like, who makes those decisions? What oversight and accountability is there? And what basis does government intervene in, you know, corporate governance and company strategy? And where does it rank in terms of voting rights and all of these types of issues that we just don't know the answers to? How long do you hold the shares for? Is it just forevermore? Are you obliged to sell them? If you do sell them, is it at a certain point in which the valuation suggests that you might get more back than you paid in? Or if you never get to that, then when do you sell it? And so we really need to understand this. And government has not been good as a shareholder. You know, another inquiry that my committee is looking at the moment is this horrible Post Office Horizon scandal, where, you know, the government was on the board of the Post Office as the main shareholder, when it was taking all of these decisions to prosecute sub-postmasters, when it knew that it wasn't really fraudulent, and, you know, there were some really very tragic circumstances, and government says, oh, well, we didn't really know anything about that. And you're like, well, you're the shareholder and you're on the board, why didn't you know about it? So I don't have any confidence that we're very well equipped to be shareholders. That isn't me saying we shouldn't be shareholders, but it means government needs to be able to do that job properly. And the very second point, before I stop wittering on, is if you're going to be an equity shareholder in businesses, you've got to manage that portfolio of risk in the best interests of taxpayers. You can't just start owning bits of everything, and then or only pick the bits that you think are going to do well, and then miss opportunities for really good investment in companies that then kind of really flourish. So the question is, well, then how is the government going to assess risk in the portfolio of companies that it owns on our behalf as shareholders? And again, this is an industrial strategy question, and we've not seen anything from the government on it yet.
Thank you. So the next question, sort of related. So John, who's a member of the Labour Business Exec Committee, says, in recent months, we've seen some great business behaviour and some less than great. How do we reward ethical and responsible businesses, those that pay well, reduce their carbon emissions, use local supply chains, pay suppliers on time, partner with trade unions, etc.? How do we raise standards and expectations of business?
So I think this pandemic has reminded people about the fundamental importance of the state, and the fact that when everything goes wrong, the state is the backstop. And what do we mean by the state? We mean all of us, right? Everything that we're borrowing is our borrowing collectively. And whenever I talk to commercial groups on this issue. I was with the British Academy the other week with the editor of the FT talking about the future of the corporation. There was Mark Carney. I did an event this week with the Institute of Directors about their new corporate governance centre. And most people tend to agree with the conclusion that this period is resetting the relationship between businesses and the state, and I would add trade unions, because the state-sponsored recovery of the economy and the way the state is having to partner with businesses is vital for their success. So to go to the heart of the question, well then how do you reward good behaviour versus bad behaviour? First of all, you need to set out what is good behaviour and what's bad behaviour. Now some of that's blindingly obvious. There have been companies where I've intervened and thankfully had an impact, where they furloughed all their staff, took public money, and then wanted to pay enormous dividends to their kind of American hedge fund owner. And we were like, that's clearly acting in bad faith with public taxpayers' money. That's unacceptable. And eventually they decided not to do that. We've seen, surprisingly, I should say surprisingly, because I just assume house builder companies are not always acting in the best interests of people, but some of the big house builders have this week confirmed that they're giving money back to government because they took the furlough payments and it's turned out actually they didn't need them, and so they're giving it back. And that's a company acting in good faith. And the way in which the state invests in businesses, and this is about tax, it's also about fiscal support, it's also about strategic decisions in the industrial strategy, it's about regulatory and policy decisions, it's around incentivizing investment in different parts of the country, it's about how you phase the net zero transition, it's a whole host of things. There is going to be partnerships between business and the state like never before for a very long time. And I do think that you can incentivize businesses, especially when it brings in private sector financing, to do the right thing. And that might be, more favorable tax solutions or whatever it might be in terms of investment into net zero transition.
Thank you. Phil McCauley asks, what can we do to help young people set up their own businesses in the new normal? And I'll add on Barry Kidson's question, which is, your pamphlet on Labour's response to the next recession was prescient. What would be the main changes you would make to it now?
Well, firstly, I'm thrilled someone read my pamphlet because I spent ages writing that over the summer last year in the hope of launching it before Christmas. And then the whole Brexit thing and the election thing kind of, got us all busy. And so I launched it rather quietly. But for those who haven't read it, for which I assume is most of the call, it essentially said, I essentially predicted there was going to be a recession in 2020 or 2021. I didn't predict a pandemic. If I did, I should have told someone, but I didn't predict that. And I said that exactly. Well, exactly. And I said in the pamphlet, monetary policy is weak right now, i.e. you can't change the Bank of England base rate because it's really, really low. And so the government needs to start significant fiscal spending now in order to mitigate the risks of a recession. And I was saying that both on digitization and net zero transition, those ought to be the priorities. How would I change it now? Now I would be much more ambitious in the amount of money we're spending. I think I wasn't calling for anything near as much as we're now anticipating spending, which in many ways is part of the opportunity of a crisis in terms of how you reset the economy. And I think the one thing I didn't get round to talking about in the pamphlet as much as I would have liked to have done was this fiscal investment in people as opposed to fiscal investment in infrastructure. And I'm very conscious of that because I always criticize the Tories for doing it, but I basically just ran out of time and couldn't fit that into the pamphlet. But it's a really, really important part of the economic recovery. And you can't do one without the other. So I'd probably change it on that. The first question on startups. See, the UK, you can start a company really easily and get going now really easily. But our approach to risk is quite bad in this country compared to other countries, both in terms of financing, but also consequences. If you're struck off as a company director, you can't be a company director in the future. I'm not sure that should just be a kind of black and white scenario. Banks and the way in which you require personal guarantees from individuals who are starting out for the first time. These factors mean that my observation, I don't know if there's any data to evidence this, but my observation is most of the startup people I see, primarily in the technology industry, come from pretty affluent backgrounds because they know that if it all goes wrong, they have some financial stability from parents or because of their own circumstances in which to weather that. And then you see kids from places like where I grew up, in my constituency from poor backgrounds, who often come up with these amazing ideas, but feel like it's too much of a risk to try to do it, because if it goes wrong, how are they going to pay their rent or their bills, or fend for their family? And I just think there's something there around the state, through innovation grants, through universities, through local authorities, to provide kind of safe environments, sandboxes for people to try to innovate, where you can kind of reduce that risk, but also try and move some of the private sector financing kind of outside of London and to other parts of the country. And in Bristol, we've been very good at doing that, but we're still very, very far behind the activity that happens in London.
I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions, if we can do that in 5 minutes. So Mark Glover asks, is nationalisation still central to Labour's economic policy? And Tony Doyle asks, this is a lengthier one. Do you think that for the Labour Party to win the next election, we need genuinely original, eye-catching ideas for our economy? Should we adopt and adapt to the market, for example, to benefit everyone? Should government loans given to support companies in trouble result in preference shares rather than standard shareholding? The dividends will make a profit on the UK borrowing costs and thereby reduce the level of taxation needed to support our society. Do you think that it would be good to highlight these ideas with the name Labour and Enterprise Party or Enterprise Labour?
Okay.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, and I have a tendency to give long answers, which I apologise. The first point on nationalisation, my concern always with nationalisation was the priority for spending, and I felt, and I said this publicly, and obviously I was criticised a bit for it, but I felt that the degree of nationalisation we were offering at the last election, when I felt that we could have been spending that money doing other things that would have achieved the types of outcomes we all want to achieve in better ways, was a kind of an ideological blind spot for us. We kind of felt like we needed to nationalise stuff in order to achieve outcomes, and I wasn't ever convinced by that argument. Doesn't mean that I'm anti-nationalisation, and we know that the UK is kind of to the extreme really in terms of infrastructure and key assets, especially being owned by often overseas funds or companies and not by the state, and that's kind of out of kilter with lots of European competitors. I'm not anti that, but I just think you have to be pragmatic about how you're spending public money. And whilst we're talking about big amounts of money right now, because interest rates are low, interest rates can change in the future. And whilst you can lock some of these in terms of kind of gilt payments with long stop dates and things, you don't want to get to a position where the cost of servicing the debt starts to kind of go like this in the next 10 or 15 years, and then reduces your ability to invest in productivity in the economy and to try and improve taxation income in order to fund public services. So you've got to get the balance right. And so I think the prioritization of the use of fiscal stimulus is really important. And as I said earlier, I don't think the Tories will get this right either. And I think we've got a really strong case to make from the Labour Party about how this can be done in the interest of many people and the country at whole. In terms of the last question, I probably won't go through all of the detail because we'll run out of time, but I think the sentiment of your question is, should Labour be seen to be more kind of pro-business? And this is probably a good question to end on, because of course Labour business does a very good job of that for us and has done for a long time. But I couldn't agree more that we need to be doing that as a whole Labour Party. And the challenge we have right now is that Keir's polling is very strong, and that's brilliant to see and quite exciting. But the Labour Party polling still isn't quite beating the Tories in its own right. And that's a real problem for us. And when you dig down, you see that many voters still don't think that on economics, we are fully trusted. So we've got a job to do, not just for Keir to carry on being good at, being leader of the Labour Party, but for all of us in the Labour Party, wherever we are, whatever role we play, to build confidence in our communities and with voters across the country that they can trust us on the economy to do the right things in their interest and the interest of the country. And our relationship with business as a delivery partner is a vital part of wealth creation and wage creation and tax creation in our country, and innovation should be a very clear message from all of us, regardless of what role we play. So I would encourage you to keep doing that at Labour Business, and I'll certainly keep doing it. And no doubt we'll continue to work together over the coming years to do so, in the hope that we finally get back into government in 2024.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was really, really interesting. I thought it was really good. Event, I will hand over to Hamish now, who's going to round up for us.
Thank you. I will just be very brief, Sienna, to thank our members in particular for all of their brilliant questions. I'll leave it to Rachel Bergen to thank the person who answered them in a moment. But it really has been a great discussion, and that's thanks to the members. And I did want to say there's a couple of questions outstanding that weren't answered, no fault on your part, but we will put those questions to Darren by an email. So we'll make sure we get a response to that. So to turn over to Rachel now, just to say, I mentioned earlier that the policy groups are the engines of our business development and policy development. And Rachel chairs one of our new and most important ones, which is Women in Business. And so I'd like to hand over to Rachel to close things off for us.
Thank you, Hamish. So thank you so much to Sienna Rodgers for chairing such a brilliant and interesting and wide-ranging interview, and for asking lots of probing questions on a wide range of issues. Thank you to Darren Jones for joining us and agreeing to be interviewed and giving such detailed and thoughtful answers again on a wide range of issues. Thank you to our members again for taking part and providing such great questions. For those of you on the line, as has been mentioned by Hamish, we have policy groups on different areas of business. So I actually co-chair the Women in Business policy group with Liz Hind, and I am going to give a specific plug for women on the call to join that policy group. But we have a wide range of policy groups, and I'd encourage you to go to our website, www.labourbusiness.org. There's a page on policy groups, and they've got details of all the different policy areas. So I would really encourage you to get involved and contribute to the policy work that we do on a wide range of business areas. And don't forget that we have a webinar with Annalise Dodds a week today, July the 9th at 6 p.m. And the invite went out this afternoon, or you can register via the website. And just to say finally, again, repeat what Hamish said, if you've asked a question and it hasn't had an answer, please email us and we will see if we can get an answer from Darren. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.